For many who fly on a regular basis, safety is not often at the forefront of the mind. After all, it is easy to become complacent after a number of uneventful trips. This applies not only to passengers who fly, but to those in aviation who are responsible for transporting us. Fortunately, many lessons have been learned in aviation through the years. But some of those lessons have been learned in pain, and some of that pain has occurred here in the Heartland. In this episode of Heartland Horrors, we will look at the tragic tale of Air Illinois Flight 710. Air Illinois was headquartered in Carbondale, Illinois, operating flights between Carbondale, St. Louis, Springfield, Chicago, and other destinations within Illinois and surrounding states. It was a crucial link between Southern Illinois University and other important cities. SIU officials often flew Air Illinois on important business trips. One of the most important flights to Carbondale was Flight 710. The flight connected Carbondale with the two most important cities in Illinois: Chicago, the largest city and home of many SIU students, and Springfield, the state capital. On board that flight were SIU professors Jerome Lorenz and Richard Baker. They researched and advocated for those with disabilities to participate in the workforce. The two had just spoken at a conference in Chicago and were traveling back home to Carbondale. Also on board was Regina Polk, a leading advocate for women in the Teamsters Union. After a massive layoff affecting many of her constituents, Polk was en route to Carbondale to discuss retraining for many of the workers who had just been laid off. On October 11, 1983, at 8:20 p.m., Illinois Flight 710 took off from Capitol Airport in Springfield, Illinois, with 7 passengers and 3 crew members aboard. About 90 seconds into the flight, an alarm went off indicating an electrical generator failure. On the aircraft used for the flight, the Hawker Siddeley HS-748, the propellers powered 2 generators that provided power to the various electrical functions through the aircraft. For some time, airline personnel had reported issues with the right generator. When receiving an alarm for a generator failure, First Officer Frank Tudor assumed that the alarm must have been for the right side generator. Following proper procedure for such an occurrence, Tudor shut down the right generator in order to isolate the defect to that particular part of the plane. Unbeknownst to the First Officer, it was actually the left generator that had failed. Subsequently, the pilots noticed that both generators were offline. First Officer Tudor was the first to notice an issue with the plane and not receiving power from the generators.
Well, the left one is totally dead. The right one is putting out voltage, but I can't get a load on it.
Okay, Frank.
What are we going to do?
Let's concentrate on the inside here.
I got the switch on.
What did you do? Anything?
Nah. Reset the RCCBs. I tried to select each side and isolate the side.
Yeah.
A short time later, Captain Les Smith advises Air Traffic Control of,
We have a slight electrical problem.
When asked if Flight 710 would return to Springfield, Captain Smith advised Air Traffic Control that Flight 710 would proceed to Carbondale. In aviation, there are 2 sets of rules for flying. There are visual flight rules known as VFR and instrument flight rules known as IFR. When weather conditions prohibit pilots from having a visual on where to safely navigate their aircraft, pilots are to use the instruments in their cockpit for maneuvering their aircraft. While rain, fog, and low ceilings were forecasted for Carbondale, it was not unprecedented for aircraft to land in such conditions. However, the pilots in this story were flying a plane whose instruments were powered by 2 generators which have both failed. In such an occurrence, there are batteries for the backup on the aircraft. However, the batteries can last for an estimated 30 minutes. Carbondale was 40 minutes away. Upon assessing the situation, the pilots decided to proceed to Carbondale rather than make an emergency landing at nearby airports such as Springfield, Litchfield, Vandalia, Greenville, Salem, or Centralia. Captain Lester Smith was notorious for taking pride in his aircraft landing on time and cutting corners on safety to ensure timely arrivals, according to fellow pilots. As Flight 710 had already been running 40 minutes behind that day, Captain Smith was anxious to get his plane to Carbondale, the town where he resided. While en route to Carbondale, the nearest on-duty air traffic controller in Kansas City attempts to line up Flight 710 for an instrument approach. However, with the failure of electrical components on the aircraft, the crew were on their own. With no instruments to guide them, the pilots were aware that they were flying completely blind. Opting to continue to Carbondale, the pilots flew into inclement weather. As they faced adversity from the meteorological conditions, the instruments slowly began to fail. As pilots assessed the situation they were in, these were the last words heard on the cockpit voice recorder. At this point, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder ceased functioning. The pilots were now deaf, dumb, and blind. In a final cruel twist of fate, the pilots had one more instrument available to them, the Altitude Directional Indicator, or ADI. However, unbeknownst to the pilots, the ADI was dependent on successful electrical distribution from the generators. With all other electrical components out of service, the pilots are shining a flashlight on the ADI to get a reading on the plane's pitch and roll. Although the ADI appears to be working, the pilots are unaware that with the failure of the electrical system, they are getting false readings. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the ADI starts falling to the left. This explains why the crash scene puts the plane in the opposite direction of Carbondale Airport. With no functioning instruments to guide them, the pilots in the pitch black of night crashed the Hawker Siddeley HS-748 into the ground in a field near Pinckneyville, Illinois, just after 9:10 p.m. When rescuers were called to the scene, the duty was grim. All crew and passengers aboard Flight 710 were dead. As a result of the investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board made multiple recommendations. First and foremost, it is the job of the first officer to speak up over any safety concerns, whether or not it damages the ego of the captain. Furthermore, the NTSB determines that the airlines lack adequate training in how crews respond to generator and battery emergencies. Lastly, the NTSB recommends that altitude directional indicators, or ADIs, have their own power source apart from the rest of the aircraft. 6 months after the crash, Air Illinois declared bankruptcy and ceased operations. The legacy of Air Illinois Flight 710 carries on in aircraft today. Primarily, ADI gauges have their own power supply, enabling pilots to safely land aircrafts in the event of a power failure. But despite the advances in safety in aviation from this and other incidents, hubris and arrogance from humans will always eventually result in tragedy.